The Soviet embassy is literally under the siege of Red Guards, and they come and they erect a platform to hang the ambassador. The Soviets make noises about a potential preemptive nuclear strike on China. The Soviet Union was already spending gold reserves to import grain. I mean, is that how you're going to build communism if you cannot even feed your own people?
Sergey, part 2, we're picking it up towards the end of 63, 64. John, take it away.
We were just talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but now we have the transition in 64 where Khrushchev is unceremoniously couped as a verb. So the question is, in your story of status and prestige, how much is there a through line versus how much does that change with each leader? And when you have something like Khrushchevism without Khrushchev that some have used to describe Brezhnev, what does this mean and how does it fit into your story?
So, John, thank you. Jordan, thank you for having me back on the podcast. Really excited about this part 2. Jumping straight in, Khrushchevism without Khrushchev. The Chinese invented this. They were unhappy with the way that the Soviets continued, in their eyes, to pressure China to adopt policies that the Chinese seemed or deemed unacceptable. And so they call that Khrushchevism without Khrushchev. They thought, although Khrushchev pursued anti-Chinese policies, he was removed, but the policies remained in place. So that explains this part. Now, this question of what happens to the standing of new leaders when you have a change of leadership, that's actually a very interesting question. Khrushchev was removed in October 1964, when at the point of his removal from power, he basically was Soviet foreign policy. He stood head and shoulders above everybody else in the Soviet Politburo. He could make decisions single-handedly without consulting anybody, like, for example, sending missiles to Cuba. Who did he consult? I mean, there were some people like Anastas Mikoyan who spoke up against this, but even so, he was very careful in speaking up against this. Khrushchev was unassailable in so many ways in his last years in power. Once he falls or is overthrown, is retired, you have a new set of Soviet leaders, including Leonid Brezhnev as the party first secretary, later becomes the general secretary. You have Alexei Kosygin, who is effectively the prime minister. And you also have somebody called Nikolai Podgorny. They have a kind of a trio, a troika of leaders, a triumvirate that runs the Soviet Union for a period of time. Now, starting from 64, Brezhnev, who is the notional, Brezhnev basically is the guy in charge, right? As the first secretary, but he feels a little bit out of his depth. Is that the right way to put it? He's out of his depth because Khrushchev ran foreign policy, and here's a new guy coming in. He's like, well, what am I supposed to do? So he's certainly consulting with others the way that Khrushchev never did. Brezhnev comes to power. He feels not entirely confident of himself, certainly not in foreign policy, and he consults with others the way that Khrushchev never did, including with Alexei Kosygin, which is, by the way, why in 1965, Alexei Kosygin goes to China in a bid to repair relations with Mao Zedong. Brezhnev doesn't do that, but Brezhnev cannot stop Kosygin from doing that. Kosygin says, I think we should repair relations with China. And Brezhnev says, well, okay, go and try to do it. And so he goes, and Brezhnev is like, okay, well, let's see what happens. Of course, nothing happens because Mao Zedong tells Kosygin that their struggle with the Soviet Union will last for 10,000 years. In the meantime, Brezhnev, in order to improve his standing and legitimacy as the leader of a communist superpower, extends aid to Vietnam. And I think when we talk about legitimacy and what practical effects this has, well, Vietnam is a key case study because Khrushchev didn't really care. Khrushchev did not care about Vietnam, and the Soviet Union was not really involved in Vietnam all that much until 1964. After 1964, of course, we have escalation. We have Gulf of Tonkin. We have, increasing American presence, but we also have renewed Soviet commitment to Vietnam. Why? Because Vietnam is an ally in need, a communist ally in need, and you need to help him. Why? Because it's for your own legitimacy and standing as the leader, especially because the Chinese are watching. The Chinese are watching. They're saying, look, the Soviets, they're trying to sell out the world communist movement. And you, as Brezhnev, you as the leader of this communist superpower world, you have to help. You have to help allies in need. And so that's why what we see is you have beginning of massive Soviet involvement in the Vietnam War, including not through their forces, but their advisors on the ground, their military equipment, etc. Would have not happened under Khrushchev, but for Brezhnev, there's a deficit of legitimacy, and Vietnam fills this gap.
Can you explain why you see this change in attitudes towards Vietnam? Because in the book, you write that Khrushchev and Mao, basically the Chinese position is conflict and struggle and violent revolution is on the Chinese side is something to be promoted, whereas Khrushchev is at that point shying away from it towards peaceful coexistence, and the Maoist side is very critical of that. And that I think plays into some degree why the Vietnamese, maybe he doesn't want to support the Vietnamese. But then Brezhnev comes in and he's not as concerned about that.
So, I struggled with this in the book because I could not understand why Khrushchev was so committed to, let's say, supporting Fidel Castro and why he did not care about the Vietnamese. And I have no answer for this except for maybe some personal factors. Ho Chi Minh was in Moscow quite a few times in the sort of late 50s, and then he was trying to, or the early 60s as well, trying to repair the relationship between the Soviet Union and China. And Ho Chi Minh contradicted Khrushchev softly, and he was trying to teach Khrushchev in a way that I think annoyed him. It's very difficult to read into these things, but somehow he just didn't like Ho Chi Minh, and he just did not want to bother about this faraway place that he did not understand. He would prefer to bother about this other faraway place that he did not understand, i.e. Cuba, for God knows what reason. So he got really involved in Cuba, but not in Vietnam. Is Brezhnev very different? I don't think. I mean, in terms of his knowledge about Vietnam, no, he's not. I mean, he's on the same page as Khrushchev. He knows nothing about Vietnam. But for him, it was a matter of really showing that he was committed to this communist cause of struggle against American imperialism. And I think part of the explanation, by the way, why he became so much more committed is that, of course, this happens right at the time of American escalation in Vietnam, right? So if you, at this point, if you don't do anything and you're like, okay, I don't care about Vietnam, let the Chinese handle them, or, the Chinese will take care of this and I'm not involved, then you look weak and you look like you've abandoned your allies. And so I think that those are the factors that contribute to this increasing Soviet involvement.
Okay, let's stay on the American involvement. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964 arguably changes a lot in the course of Chinese history, in the course of the sort of menage a trois between the U.S., the Soviets, and the Chinese. On the Chinese side, you read into their documents and you have Mao's Third Front basically inaugurated at this point, and he's able to build that, like, the biggest economic change since the Great Leap Forward. So maybe from your perspective in your writing this book, what did you find that maybe, and maybe you can introduce it too for people who are less familiar, but also what is it about this that, maybe we were less clear about or that you saw that was new when you looked back at it?
So, John, the most interesting thing for me when it came to Vietnam, and of course there's a whole chapter in the Vietnam War in the book, is that we used to think about Vietnam, and certainly in the West we think about Vietnam as, America's war in Vietnam. So, boots on the ground, American Marines, the Tet Offensive, and how that impacted the United States, and, et cetera, et cetera. So the bombing of Vietnam, and so on. So we see at this through American look at the situation through American eyes. What I was doing in this chapter is I was trying to understand how Vietnam mattered for the Soviets. And what I discovered was that for them, it was not even so much about the American involvement in Vietnam. That's not what drove them crazy. What the Soviets were really worried about was their competition with China and how Vietnam figured in that. Because, of course, as you mentioned, the Chinese in the mid-1960s became increasingly radicalized, and they saw Vietnam as a case study where they would showcase their influence and their vision for a world revolution. And Mao was at the forefront, and he was advising the Vietnamese leaders, saying, well, what, the Americans are invading? Well, that's not a big deal. That's fine. You can, as he said at one point, you have green hills in Vietnam, and you can go into the green hills and there's always firewood there and stuff like that. And you would read it. What the hell was he talking about? But anyway, it was this kind of thing, right? It was this kind of attitude that revolution is on our side. The future is on our side. So let's fight against the Americans and let's not listen to the Soviets, because the Chinese, of course, were really upset about the Vietnamese taking Soviet aid. And the Vietnamese are trying to balance between the two sides, telling the Chinese, oh yeah, we admire Chairman Mao, you're so wise, you're giving such good advice. On the other hand, thinking, we need Soviet aid because we need their weapons to fight against the Americans. So they're balancing on both sides. And from the Soviet perspective, this is basically a struggle for influence. Who wins? Is it we, the Soviets, win in Vietnam and we establish our influence there? Or is it the Chinese who do that, who win in Vietnam? And so that is their Vietnam War. It's much more about China. It's much more about their competition for leadership in the communist world. And not so much about America. You see, that's a different perspective, and I think I have a lot to say about that in the book. That I think a lot of even people who are really familiar with the Vietnam War will find this perspective quite, I don't know, refreshing or not, but certainly new.
Another interesting point that you bring up is the logistical aspect of this, of how the Soviets are getting the aid to the Vietnamese. They have to go through China in part. There's a U.S. sort of innovation on that time too. I think I'm getting my history right. The first containerized shipping starts to come into play, which is a way of getting material to their fight. So is this something that you looked into more deeply in terms of like what the Chinese were interfering with the Soviet aid to Vietnam, and what can you say about that?
It's really awkward. Yeah.
Well, it's awkward because, the Chinese cannot say, the Chinese cannot tell the Vietnamese, look, we hate the Soviets, so therefore you're not getting any aid from them. We'll just block it at the border, right? But in reality, they try to slow it down. And so there was a pileup of train shipments at the border. And when the weapons went through China, they have to cross China to go all the way to sort of, to southern China and then on to Vietnam. Sometimes those train consignments, the stuff that the Soviets were sending, sometimes it was looted by the Red Guards, and there was something like a civil war in China going on in the 1960s. It was chaos, right? It was chaos. But from the Soviet perspective, they would always raise it with the Vietnamese. They would say, look at the Chinese, they're your friends. You say they're your friends, but look what they're doing. They're not allowing our weapons, which you desperately need. They're stopping them, and their problem. And the Vietnamese will just say, oh, please, let us handle it. We will handle it. And, we have to be very careful. We have to understand the Chinese are having a difficult time, etc. So, but this was a real problem for the Vietnamese and certainly propaganda point for the Soviets in the late 1960s.
Were the Vietnamese actually that unruffled by what the Chinese were interfering with the shipments?
I think they hated it. There are so many things that the Vietnamese hated about what the Chinese were doing in the 1960s. I mean, we have to understand, of course, the Chinese were extending considerable aid themselves to Vietnam. I mean, their aid was also important in terms of light weapons, in terms of railroad workers, 300,000 people at some point. It's just over the entire period. So it was actually considerable Chinese involvement on the ground, and it was important to the North Vietnamese. But what they did not like was the Chinese interfering with the Soviet weapons shipments. One, B, their whole pressure on Vietnam to stop taking Soviet aid. They did not like this at all. And one thing they really hated was when Chinese in domestic politics became radicalized during the Cultural Revolution. So we're talking about sort of from mid-1966 onwards. And the Chinese tried to promote Cultural Revolution in Vietnam. I mean, if you imagine being the Vietnamese at this point, fighting this war against the Americans, and the Chinese come with their crazy radical ideas and Red Guards and whatnot, that is not something that's going to sell with the Vietnamese Communist Party leadership very well. So you see already at that point a kind of a cooling in the Vietnamese approach towards China. They don't like what the Chinese are doing, and they're more willing to listen to the Soviet advice. And the Soviet advice, by the way, is basically talk to the Americans. It's time to end this war, or at least just engage in peace talks. And so the Soviet advice consistently is engaged in peace talks. The Chinese say, just keep fighting.
So would recommend folks to check out The Dragon in the Jungle, the Chinese Army in the Vietnam War, which is a fun dive into Chinese archives looking at this question in particular of like the subtle and not so subtle aid and the tensions where, you start preaching Cultural Revolution while the Vietnamese are just like, can you just give us some guns and like leave the ideology out of it? But anyways, all right, let's take it to Nixon. Brezhnev all of a sudden like develops this incredible love affair with America's least lovable. I mean, I guess we got more than one in the running, but like one of America's least lovable president. What changed about his approach to Vietnam, the U.S. and China once Nixon came onto the scene?
So, Jordan, in the way of introduction, we have to understand where Brezhnev finds himself in the late 1960s. First of all, there's a war going on, effectively war with China, right? They actually fight a border war in March 1969 over this little island that is actually closer to the Chinese side of the Usuri River. So the Chinese have actually a reasonable claim, but they fight a war over this island, and then the Soviets make noises about a potential preemptive nuclear strike on China. So this is a nasty situation. And the Soviets are worried about the Chinese invasion. The Chinese, by the way, are afraid of the Soviet invasion. Afraid does not cover it. They're paranoid. They think the Soviets are basically ready to spread prox, to do the Czechoslovak kind of operation 1968 all over again by 1969. They're really preparing for the Soviet invasion. The Soviets, by contrast, are thinking that the Chinese are going to invade Siberia. There's even a joke about that, Soviet era joke about the war between the Soviet Union and China that lasted for only 2 days. So on the first day, the war is declared, and on the second day, the Chinese surrender, and 100 million Chinese cross over the border as prisoners of war, and then the Soviet Union declares unconditional capitulation. So there's this kind of, a sense in the Soviet Union of China as an existential threat on their border in the Far East. And that drives Brezhnev nuts. I mean, he really hated the Chinese so deeply. You can see that in his various commentary, in these comments about China and the Chinese, or how they're unreliable, how you can never trust them, how, there's a lot of Oriental trope there.
Yeah.
One of the things that I was able to do in my book, which I found very interesting, was I tracked where Brezhnev got his ideas about China from, and it actually turns out that it's from 19th century Russian Orientalist literature.
Let's stay on that like weird racist arc for a second, because like, do you think him thinking, Chinese are Orientals and the only people I can like actually have understandings and do deals with are white leaders? Like, is that like, how would you assign the percentage of like him truly believing that versus, he's handed this Sino-Soviet crisis and then is going to kind of like back into any rationale?
I mean, I think it's both. You see that under Khrushchev, even when the relationship with China is pretty close. Khrushchev never trusted Mao, and he kind of thought that Mao was this, sketchy character, dictatorial in his ways, etc. And then once the relationship really starts to deteriorate in the 1960s, it becomes so much more pronounced, both for Khrushchev and especially for Brezhnev, who basically just goes full-blown racist on China, saying really nasty things about the Chinese, and contrasting them very negatively with the Europeans and the Americans, whom he thinks, you can have a good relationship with. Now, we have to, of course, put this in context. What is happening in China in 1966-67? Crazy stuff is happening. I mean, the Soviet embassy is literally under the siege of Red Guards, and they come and they erect a scaffold, platform to hang the ambassador. And this is canceled at the last moment because Zhou Enlai comes out and, talks this. I think it was a 14-year-old girl who was in charge of this Red Guard contingent who were trying to storm the Soviet embassy. It's like Zhou Enlai is like, no, this would interfere with diplomatic relations, so they canceled the operation. But from the point of view of the Soviet diplomats, they're about to be lynched, and this is all sent to Moscow in the form of reports, etc. The Soviets are reading this thing, what is going on? These people are crazy. So that contributes to this kind of quite racist thinking about the Chinese and complete, failure to understand what's going on there. I mean, the Soviets were not alone. I mean, nobody could understand what the hell was going on in China. Cultural revolution was madness in so many ways, but it contributed to Brezhnev thinking about Europe is where he really wanted to have a good relationship, build bridges. And already in the late 1960s, he begins, even in the mid 60s, his engagement with de Gaulle, Pompidou, then later with Willy Brandt after the German Social Democrats come to power in September 1969. Brezhnev feels that, Willy Brandt is the way to go, and Willy Brandt, of course, has his Ostpolitik in the promise of economic cooperation with the Soviets. So Brezhnev starts developing this kind of European detente before he even turns to the United States. What really and by the way, at this point, he's saying nasty things about Nixon. Nixon, of course, is known to the Soviet leaders. Wasn't he in Moscow in 1959 having a wonderful time with Khrushchev in the infamous kitchen debates, right? So they know who Nixon is, so they don't like Nixon. And Brezhnev also says things about Nixon that are not very complimentary, but then things change. So what changes is, first and foremost, you have the summer 1971, Henry Kissinger visit to Beijing and the announcement of Nixon's forthcoming visit to Beijing, to China, right, which happens in February 1972. Now, Brezhnev sees that as, oh my God moment. I don't know if he believed in God, but he's thinking the Americans the Chinese are our enemies. The Americans are going there, so this is really bad. So we have to get Nixon to come to Moscow, and he really invests himself into this summit. And of course, it does happen ultimately in May 1972, and he develops a fairly friendly relationship with the American president. And then after that, I think it really builds from that, actually. Somehow he thinks that he has Nixon's trust, and he goes then to Washington and visits with Nixon and goes all the way to Nixon's Western White House, which is not far from LA.
All right, so we have Nixon and we have Brezhnev kind of having this real push towards entente with Nixon. One of the really interesting things that you emphasize is like how when Khrushchev was envisioning himself on the world stage, he really thought the sort of delta was positive in the relative balance of global power. And once he gets his nuclear weapons, he really thinks he can spread his wings and start playing some big games. But Brezhnev, as you say, he has this different vision of the US and Soviet Union relationship where they'll just sort of run the world together. I'm curious, what was that mental, bounding of Soviet ambitions, and how did he come to that, and how did that manifest in the policies?
So, Jordan, to explain that, let's go back to Khrushchev. Khrushchev was a really optimistic character, and he thought that the Soviet Union was just surging ahead and was just doing so well economically. Also, in terms of science and technology, the launching of Sputnik, breakthroughs in space and so on and so forth, that made Khrushchev really optimistic. And that's for, it's for good reason that he proclaimed that in 20 years' time, they would, quote unquote, establish communism. As the Soviet joke goes, they decided to hold Olympic Games instead, because it never was going to be realized, But in 1960, it seemed like this was possible. But then after this, things really went downhill pretty quickly. You had, the Soviet economic situation wasn't turning out so well. In 1963, the Soviet Union was already importing grain and spending gold reserves to import grain. I mean, is that how you're going to build communism if you cannot even feed your own people? So that was a major problem. And then you get into the late 1960s, it's totally obvious that this promise of communism is not being realized. The Soviet Union is not coming closer to that goal of building abundance for everyone and bringing about this joy for the socialist commonwealth that was, part and parcel of that initial promise that Khrushchev had made. And so, indeed, in 1968, I talk about in this book, you have this memorandum from Andropov to Brezhnev, which basically says, look, we're losing the Cold War. We are losing to the Americans because we're not investing enough in R&D, in education, our labor productivity is low, and so on and so forth, for lots of reasons. And also, I was able to access the Soviet Politburo discussion from 1966, which are hundreds of pages of discussions about the state of the Soviet economy, and they all knew that all of that it's just not going well. They tried to implement reforms, Kosygin reforms, introducing incentives, basically making it more capitalist, but it wasn't working. As you try to tinker with it here and there, the whole system was just garbage, right? It was just not delivering. And so because of that, the ideological underpinnings of the Soviet systems really started to fall apart. It was not, it's a dream that people were not buying anymore because the material abundance was not there. And Brezhnev, I think, understood that. So Brezhnev was looking for a new idea, and that is where this external aspect of greatness comes into play. That is where this idea that America will recognize the Soviet Union as an equal superpower, and that is something we can sell to the Soviet people as our achievement, that becomes so important to him. And together with this comes the idea of peace, and Brezhnev sees himself as a peacemaker leader of the USSR. In his conversations with Nixon, he would often refer to the fact that the Soviet Union and the United States together had enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world 6, 7, 8 times over. And so they had a responsibility to fix the world, i.e. to resolve the nuclear problem, to fix the Chinese, because the Chinese were going crazy, work together with the United States, and develop a kind of a condominium. And that is why you have that moment, which gave title to the book, To Run the World. It came from that moment in the spring of 1973 when Henry Kissinger went to Moscow and Brezhnev took him hunting. Boars, wild pigs. It was outside of Moscow in this dacha, and they were in this hunting tower. Just Brezhnev, Kissinger, and the interpreter, and they were waiting for pigs to come and feed so they could shoot them dead. Kissinger recounts that. And then Kissinger recounts that later in the conversation with Nixon. He said, look, Brezhnev told me, let's just don't take any notes, but I'll tell you this. What we want to do is we want to run the world together with the United States. And so, that struck me as a very interesting proposition from a leader of a communist superpower working together with the United States. I mean, how do you even explain this from a Marxist-Leninist perspective? That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense, but it does make sense from the idea of, selling the Soviet greatness to the Soviet people. The Americans, they're recognized as a great power, therefore we're a great power. That's how it works.
It strikes me how at odds this is, I think, with the perception of, someone who's moderately familiar with the history looking back, especially nowadays when you have strategists talking about, a new sort of Sino-Soviet or a new sort of Russian-Chinese split, and they can use this to their benefit, peel Russia away from China. Whereas in this history that you're bringing up, it's so strange that both the Soviet side and the Chinese side, for their own reasons, to different intensities at different times, are both seeking to basically align with the U.S. against the other nominally communist regime. It's just an interesting dynamic that is going on there, and I don't really is there some interesting lesson there for today, or just maybe what strikes you about that is so people are forgetting today?
So it's my favorite example of how ideology can be just cast aside. We can talk about China being this revolutionary power that wanted to complained endlessly about the Soviet Union betraying the revolution and, wanted to promote the revolution worldwide. And then we get to the 1960s, late 1960s, and after complaining endlessly about the Soviet Union betraying the revolution, they basically come right around and embrace the United States. And actually, I talk about this in the book as well. This is something, there was an interesting moment. When was that? I think it was in the fall of 1970, if memory serves me right. But Edgar Snow, who was a biographer of Mao, turns up in China. And he occasionally turned up in China. And so the Chinese leader thought that he was a CIA spy, which was actually not true because he was a leftist journalist. And so he turns up in China and has a conversation with Mao Zedong in which he says, we think that Nixon, Mao says, we think that Nixon is a good fellow. And Edgar Snow's like, okay. Well, that's a strange thing to say, right?
Edgar Snow didn't agree about that.
Yeah, Edgar Snow was like, well, how can you say that? And then Mao Zedong repeats himself, well, no, we think he's the best fellow in the world. And so And so this conversation, Mao, of course, hoped that Edgar Snow would carry this to the Nixon administration because, of course, he's a CIA agent, you see. But what's interesting is later the summary of this conversation was circulated to the party committees around China to introduce the Chinese people to this idea that China is changing course and they're turning towards the United States. And you know how party committees, they would have kind of fake debates. So they had debates and questions were collected. And those questions were reported back to the center. And questions included questions like, why is it that we are, if Nixon is the number one best fellow in the world, why is it that we're having a quarrel with the Soviet Union? Can't we repair relations with them as well? So the Chinese party officials were confused about this, but Mao would not have any of that. That these people don't understand strategy. We have to turn to the United States because the Soviet Union is the enemy. You see, it doesn't matter that turning to the United States entails turning to quote unquote imperialism, although we're a communist country. That's not what matters. So that is what, John, going back to your question, that is something that strikes me so much, how at that point, both the Soviet Union and China were able and willing to basically set ideology aside and turn to the United States and try to improve relations with them on the basis of kind of, geopolitical great power sort of competition with each other. That's very interesting.
That's exactly what I was thinking, because normally the story is you have brilliant strategists and you have Kissinger making that flight to Pakistan and then secretly flying off to China for this engagement. But some have argued, and I think your findings support this, that Mao in some ways, insofar as anyone deserves credit, it might be him sort of making this move. Although I do have a question about that, because reading back through Mao's various writings, when he talks about the Japanese, for instance, he will sometimes half jokingly, half seriously saying, the Japanese are the people that we have to thank the most because without them, we would never have come into power. Are you sure there's no element of a sort of speaking out of his, tongue in cheek here when he's saying these things about Nixon being the number one good fellow?
So you always have to be careful with his pronouncements, and Mao does say that about the Japanese consistently, and what he basically means by that is because of the Japanese invasion, the nationalists were weakened. The Kuomintang Party was weakened, which provided the space for the Chinese communists to establish their power. So in a sense, it does make sense. It does make sense what he says about the Japanese. So we have to thank them. Of course, he's being sarcastic to a certain extent. We have to thank the Japanese for the fact that the Chinese communists came to power. But he's being sarcastic here. With regard to Nixon, when Nixon and Mao meet in February 1972, Nixon tries to kind of engage him in the conversation, and Mao kind of brushes it all aside and says, you can talk to Zhou Enlai about practical matters. I don't care about practical matters. I want to talk about philosophical matters. And he says something like, we like rightists, and we voted for you in the 1968 election. And I don't think Nixon quite gets that. Nixon is like, okay, well, listen. But what Mao is trying to do is he's trying to basically say that he finds the Republicans more trustworthy because although they're reactionary as far as Mao is concerned, at least you always know where they stand. Whereas with the Soviets, you don't. They say one thing, they cover their actions with leftist phraseology, but in reality, they do something completely different. And the same goes for social democrats. And so he's full of disdain for social democrats like the Europeans, like Willy Brandt and, those people in Europe who are basically trying to engage with the Soviet Union, which would allow the Soviet Union to deal with China. And he's accusing the Western Europeans of trying to orchestrate another Munich where they would sell out China and the Soviet Union will turn there. So that is the kind of issues that Mao brings up. And I think he's quite honest about it. It's not a sarcastic comment when he says that he likes Nixon.
So the Soviets also really like Nixon. And I think this is probably my favorite part of your book. Certainly, I thought it was the funniest. I was actually laughing. They find out, they hear about the Watergate scandal and see Nixon about to be removed from power. And Brezhnev is flipping out thinking that the whole political system in the U.S. is like specifically trying to undermine détente and the relation that's going on, and then sends Andropov. He's like, you've got to help Nixon. You've got to find some dirt on his opponents to help him. I think it was Andropov.
I mean, it is funny. It is funny. It just shows what kind of great materials you can find in the Russian archives, where you have this, this particular episode. Of course, Andropov is the head of the KGB, and you have Brezhnev's aide asking, well, do we have some compromise on Nixon's opponents that we can help Nixon? I mean, it is kind of hilarious. But yeah, I mean, the Soviets, they never could understand Watergate. Mao also did not understand Watergate. They could not just they could not understand in their minds how you could actually remove such a wonderful president who is creating détente and who's, just bringing the Cold War to an end.
And just won a big election.
Yeah, I just want to, how, clearly it's some kind of a conspiracy. And at one point they say, you see, they killed Kennedy, and now the same people, they're bringing Nixon down. I think that was Brezhnev's take on this. So yeah, they never get it. They never understand what this is about.
Honestly, that is such a crazy time in American politics, from that decade on, of president literally having his brains blown out on TV to then having a president actually impeached, removed from office. I think we forget about it today, like how things have been very crazy in the past. And the last analogy that I was thinking of is when Nixon is about to become president. Some people say that he engaged in I think the technical term is treasonous act, by being in contact with the Vietnamese and basically trying to discourage them from a peace deal. But he has a lot of rhetoric that might sound familiar to people today who pay attention to the news at all and look at Ukraine. And he's coming in and saying, this war is in Vietnam is complete disaster. We need to do everything we can to get out of it immediately. But then in his case, and what ends up happening is an escalation beyond anything that had been seen previously. And I don't know how much of a warning that would be for today, but I did think it was, to be fair, I heard Stephen Hawking bring this up, so I did think it was an interesting analogy. If there's obviously a lot of disanalogies or not things that don't map on equally, but I thought it was interesting to bring up.
Yeah, I mean, I saw also Neil Ferguson raised this in a recent article comparing Trump to Nixon. I mean, the difference, I think, here between Ukraine and Vietnam is that in the late 1960s, American troops were in Vietnam, and that had a direct impact on American society, on American politics. There were anti-war protests going on in the United States. Today, American troops are not in Ukraine. And you don't have the same kind of impact. You don't have the protests. It's not the same kind of situation for that reason. But I think both Nixon and Trump saw both theaters as effectively, or in Trump's case, continue to see the Ukrainian theater is peripheral to America's core interests. So there's a parallel there. But yeah, I mean, you're right. Nixon's way to get out of Vietnam was to try to coerce Vietnam, including by intensifying the bombing, dropping threats of a nuclear attack on Vietnam, which did not really work, and also working with the Soviets. And that was, by the way, from his perspective, that was a big part of the whole engagement with the USSR. Finding an exit for the United States. Peace with honor, right? Getting out of Vietnam and getting the Soviets to facilitate this. The problem was the Soviets were not really facilitating any of this, because from the Soviet perspective, they loved the fact that the Americans were engaging with them. They loved the honor of being the co-equal superpower. But if you're a co-equal superpower, aren't you supposed to have clients? And aren't you supposed you're not supposed to betray your clients or force them to surrender to the United States. So for them, this linkage never worked. They thought that they could both help Vietnam and have a good relationship with the United States. And that did not really work for the Americans.
Yeah, I love this line in your conclusion. This is talking about Khrushchev, but applies to Brezhnev as well. The core question is, would he be willing to moderate Soviet foreign policy in return for being accepted as America's equal? The proposition never worked because of the very fact that being accepted as America's equal meant rejecting external constraints on foreign policy behavior. What sort of equality would you talk about then if you couldn't, have proxy wars or missiles in Cuba? Soviet engagement in the third world, and indeed American acceptance of this engagement, were part and parcel of what it meant to be a superpower. So I think this kind of gets at the other core question as we come to the end of Brezhnev's salinity, is like, if he, stayed healthy and if Nixon wasn't impeached, like they kind of sort of had a good thing going. But once his health turns and Nixon goes, then you argue that bureaucratic interests take over, and everything kind of starts ramping up again. Thoughts on the transition and to what extent the leaders could have made a difference in this particular perspective.
I mean, it's hugely important. We're talking about health and power. It's a question. It's a big question for late USSR, and you might argue also for not just for the USSR, right? We're also familiar with this question in the West, to be perfectly frank. But so Brezhnev is very charismatic, very active, very engaged until about 74, and then he just declines rapidly, goes downhill. He's got all kinds of ailments, and he becomes basically figurehead. He doesn't, by the late 1970s, does he decide anything? Not really. I mean, if you look at what he was doing, if you look, for example, at his summit with Carter in Vienna, I mean, he was just reading out from pieces of paper. He was not even thinking about what was he's reading. When Carter responded, he would turn to his aides and ask, what should I say now? And they would give him another piece of paper, and he would read from that. Talking about the deep state. This is where this is the Soviet deep state, and it really takes hold in the late 1970s in a major kind of way. So you have a takeover. You have the bureaucratic interests that take over, and here you have the Ministry of Defense that becomes really, really important. And for them, promotion of various kind of geopolitical schemes in the third world is a very important issue. They also resist disarmament, by the way, nuclear disarmament. They think it's a bad idea. They want more investments from the state. So increasingly, the Soviet economy becomes more and more militarized. You have the interests of the International Department of the Soviet Communist Party, whose role it is to promote revolutions in the third world. So you have, functionaries. I mean, it's in their job description, right? Promote revolutions. And these people become more active. And if previously, Brezhnev would have basically kind of pushed them away because it's beyond their pay grade to define policy. By the mid to late 1970s, they come to influence policy in major way. And we see that in the increasing Soviet involvement in Africa and promotion of revolution there. And then you have foreign ministry, you have the KGB, and they all have their distinct interests. And so those bureaucratic interests increasingly come to dominate Soviet policymaking, with the result that it kind of drifts. It becomes more conservative overall because there's no single figure who could just break the ice and say, we'll do that, the way that Brezhnev did with the Nixon summit in 1972, because the bureaucracy was against it. He says, I will do that because I think it's important. Well, now he can't do it because he is mentally no longer alert. So it is a part of, it's a part of the story of Soviet decline. It also shows how having an active leader at the top could actually have good results. Not always, because sometimes you could have an active dictator at the top and he will do some awfully terrible things, really terrible things, even though precisely because he's not constrained by the bureaucracy. But in the Soviet case in the late 1970s, what you have is the power at the top is missing and the bureaucracy takes over.
And I think maybe the last important thing, Brezhnev is not really conscious, but it happens under him, is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, where exactly to your point, you have, I guess, Gromyko, Andropov, and Ustinov, who are the KGB defense, the Troika, right? And so, they get into Afghanistan. And on the U.S. side, my understanding is Carter and maybe Brzezinski are looking at this as, is this a play for getting all the way to the Persian Gulf? What is the motivation going on here? And maybe there's some, if you were to pull out what is a lesson of what we can know about if there is a continuity of motivations between regimes. What did you find, if there was anything new there about what was motivating them?
So I found some interesting things. I mean, we've had so many people write about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, from Arnie Westad to Roderick Braithwaite, and many other people have written about Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It was difficult to find anything new, but I did manage to find something new, and I found in particular very interesting materials on the fall dating back to the fall of 1979, when already you have a conflict between Taraki and Amin in Kabul, but Amin had not yet killed Taraki, and Taraki comes to Moscow. And Brezhnev had a conversation with him, and a conversation, I don't know, that's a conversation in quotation marks, because Brezhnev is in no position to have any productive conversation, but he does offer a warning to Taraki. He says, look, when you go there, be careful, because there's a problem. We think there's a problem in your kind of senior party ranks. And Taraki says, oh, Leonid Ilyich, don't you worry about it. Everything is fine. And he goes back there. Of course, he's arrested by Amin's men and ultimately put in prison and murdered in prison on Amin's orders. Now, what we see then is Soviet thinking about how what to do about this. And their first instinct is actually to work with Amin, despite the fact that they think that Taraki, the death of Taraki is such an absolute slap in the face, a betrayal of the USSR. They feel that they could work with Amin because he's surrounded by quote unquote, pro-Soviet people who had studied in the USSR. And Brezhnev writes about it. There's some kind of, exchange of memoranda at this senior leadership. I talk about it in the book. Which suggests that they might continue working with Amin. But then it seems that they come to this decision that, no, they have to remove him. And that happens by December 1979. They come to this decision. And so I ask in the book as to why, what happens there. And to me, there are different reasons that could potentially explain Soviet involvement, from something like, the fact that the Soviets are just adrift and nobody's making foreign policy anymore. But I think that doesn't really explain it. I think a more interesting explanation, and I highlight this in the book, is that they worried that Amin would do a Sadat on them. In other words, they lost Sadat in Egypt, President Sadat, who was supposed to be kind of a pro-Soviet client, but they basically dumped them because he decided that he will go with Kissinger and Nixon, and basically the Soviets got outplayed in Egypt. And so after that, after quote-unquote losing Egypt, the Soviets just look at almost every country in the Middle East as potentially another Egypt, and Afghanistan is exactly that. And so they're suspicious of Amin. They think that he has some kind of ties with the Americans. They're getting the hints and information that he's in contact with the Americans. And so they conclude that he's potentially pro-American and potentially sell them out. And the Americans would then come into Afghanistan, and that would be a strategic problem for them, for the Soviets, and so on. So they decide to, I think on that basis, they didn't want Amin to become another Sadat. I think that's probably the main reason.
Shall we transition to Gorbachev? Jordan, do you want to start it off with the analogy, the Gorbachev analogy?
Trump Gorbachev?
I was just going to say, you get I was calling American perestroika, Doge's American perestroika, at least in the very charged anti-bureaucratic, take an axe to, under Gorbachev, I think they decreased the employment in the ministries and the party personnel by something like 30 to 40%, which I think they will certainly aspire to if they can reschedule enough civil service personnel in the U.S. You have Gorbachev willingly giving up the Warsaw Pact, which some people might analogize to Trump with NATO. And ultimately, as Axios reported, you have the search for Trump's desire for a Nobel Prize, and sort of the prestige and legitimation of doing something great by some foreign audience, which of course people very much criticized Gorbachev for writing his 1987 book Perestroika while they were doing Perestroika, which he wrote I think he had it translated immediately into English, and it was written for a U.S. publisher.
Yeah, it was also published in the USSR, by the way, but Perestroika and New Thinking. I think historical analogies are limited to some extent, but I see some parallels. It's very interesting. One counterpoint that I would maybe offer is that the Soviet economy was basically going to hell in the 1980s, and they knew it. They knew that it was not doing well. They knew that they were losing the Cold War. They knew that the promise of deliverance for the Soviet people. It was just a fake promise. The American economy, actually, if you look at productivity, if you look at investment in technology, R&D, etc., it's just so far beyond anything else anybody in the world can offer. So the question is that of necessity. I mean, I understand that some people will say, no, America has to carry out reforms because look at A, B, and C, look at the size of the national debt, or look at this, or look at that. And I get this, but I think in the Soviet case, perestroika was necessary. It was necessary, and they knew they had to do it. I mean, they knew it in the 60s that they had to do it. They did not do it in the 60s because they craved cadre stability under Brezhnev. They were trying to avoid, political upheavals, and also they were to a certain extent bailed out by the price of oil and by the discovery of oil in Western Siberia, which they could now basically, sell for hard cash, and it would help at least feed the Soviet people because you could then import grain and some technologies. So, but they knew it wasn't working. And so when Gorbachev came to power, he had to begin doing something because doing nothing was not an option.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, though. You're right. He had everything in 1985, an empire, however decrepit, an ideology, however stale, above all, an office and a truly awesome power. What he did not have was greatness as he chose to understand it, greatness before history. And he pursued that fleeting dream for himself and his country all the way to the famous Pizza Hut ad. And, it's interesting when you compare, like, what Gorbachev and all these other historical figures we've been talking about define greatness as, and what Trump's defines greatness as, because the Trump definition is just so much kind of smaller and more personal and more like, people respect me and, speak to me nicely in the Oval Office or whatever, whereas like all these other folks, they have these vision of being these grand historic figures that like defeat communism or whatever. And, there are parts of Trumpism, right, where it's like, okay, we're going to like revive America and we're going to defeat wokeness and we're going to, bring back ideals. And like every once in a while, he'll like say something about manufacturing or whatever. But like it's the Make America Great Again is so much more personalized about like how Trump is doing and how he's feeling and how he's being treated than it really is a kind of like national vision of prestige and greatness, which is what we've seen throughout talking about these decades in these three countries.
I mean, it's related to a certain extent, right? The Soviet leaders desired greatness for themselves and for their country. And I feel actually, in a sense, this book also is applicable to almost any other would-be great power or superpower. And to a certain extent, it can be read as an allegory of the United States. This is, by the way, how John Lewis Gaddis saw it in his review in Foreign Affairs. He thought that between the lines, the United States was clearly lurking there, that, I'm kind of really telling the American story, not just the Soviet story. But this question of legacy, I think that is super, super interesting and super important because, as you say, Jordan, here Gorbachev is basically the helm of the superpower. He's got all the power concentrated in his hands. And yet he wants something more. It's sort of like Mao Zedong. Think about Mao Zedong in, let's say, 1965. He had all the power in his hand. He could do anything. And then even if he thought that there were some people conspiring against him, well, he got rid of those people by 1966. And yet he continued this cultural revolution. For what? For legacy, for this greatness before history. And I think that's very important. And, jumping forward, and I realize that's very confusing, but if you think about Putin and his invasion of Ukraine, he has all the power in his hand, and he's doing this. He's invading Ukraine for what? For greatness before history, the way he understands greatness. So I think if you go back to Gorbachev once again, and you say, well, fundamentally, why did he do it? And the answer is because he wanted something greater than what he had. He wanted to be remembered as a person who would bring the Soviet idea to life for the first time, because he thought that his predecessors never made it work, and he would make it work. He would make it globally applicable, and he would end the Cold War. And this was his mission. And so that, I think, is very important.
Yeah, I mean, we talked in the first episode, right, as national ambition, is it a gas or is it a solid, right? Is it going to expand until it hits another thing that's just going to bear it in, or does it have some sort of natural limits? And it's interesting to kind of analogize that, not at a national level, but just as a personal level. It's like, okay, you're in power for 15 years, you get bored, you're probably already a bit of a gambler if you are able to kind of make it all the way up to a system, and you just want more, right? It's just like all these people. This is why you want term limits, is because you gotta go a little cuckoo, and either you go senile like Brezhnev, and thankfully doesn't start World War III because he's worried about his bladder or whatever, or you really start I don't know, you do stuff like Putin in Ukraine. It's a scary thing to contemplate.
No, I agree. I think that is a really a fascinating thing to think how these leaders, perhaps out of boredom, perhaps because they have nothing else to do things. And you might think, okay, that's ridiculous. But actually, speaking of boredom, Putin one time was asked something about Ukraine in one of his recent press conferences, and he said basically that, well, we were kind of bored and we decided to do it. I'm paraphrasing, but literally he mentioned the word boredom in his comments and on why he invaded Ukraine. And that sounds crazy, right? But if you are a leader with all the power in your hands, you really have you really need something else. And it's I think Schopenhauer, back in the early 19th century, in his reflections, actually said that one of the major problems that human beings face is generally the problem of boredom. They don't know what to do with themselves. Now, multiply that with bring in absolute power, and then you get people like Gorbachev who think, hey, why not do something so great that everybody will remember me by this, and well, he certainly succeeded.
You sort of have a hedonic treadmill effect, I think, when it comes to status. You've achieved so much, and yet when you look back, once you've achieved it, well, you could achieve more, and the last thing you achieved no longer seems as good. And now you're wondering, well, how can I really leave a legacy that my children and my children's children will remember?
The whole country, the whole world.
The whole world. What better than changing your borders, acquiring Greenland, getting back Panama?
Why exactly? Or launching perestroika. That's why Gorbachev's book, which you referred to, the one that was published in the West, was actually called, the subtitle was "Perestroika for Our Country and for the World." He was trying to restructure the entire world and not just his own country. That's still, the extent of ambition.
Yeah, and I think maybe we can talk a little bit about the dance that the Europeans and the Americans did with Gorbachev, because kind of your goal, if you're in the Cold War and you're playing containment, right, is to get the other side to understand that, yeah, its relative power is going to be decreasing, and America and the G7 or G20 or whatever, or America and its allies over the course of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they won the science and technology race. But to also be able to kind of, when you see a leader like Gorbachev and you allow him to pursue that kind of vision, without I don't know, we came kind of close to a Stalinist revanchism, right? That wasn't totally out of the cards. But talk a little bit about the, how the West kind of managed Gorbachev's moment of defining national greatness as perestroika, and not, conquering Germany or something.
Sure. I mean, first of all, the Americans were quite worried about Gorbachev to begin with. That's a well-known story. Why were they worried about him? Because they thought that he could actually succeed in what he claimed to be doing. Reinvent the Soviet idea and make the Soviet Union into a much more serious competitor, strategic competitor to the United States. So they were worried about Gorbachev. There were some that thought that Gorbachev wasn't, quote unquote, wasn't for real, and his reforms would be ultimately undone. etc. And then I think, I mean, a moment did come where American leaders thought that they could actually reach out to Gorbachev in the name of international peace and try to achieve important agreements with him. I think Reagan was the key person here, because Reagan also had that belief in the importance of avoiding nuclear war, in the great responsibility that was on his shoulders. I mean, we think about Reagan. A lot of people, certainly in the United States, like to talk about Reagan as quote unquote winning the Cold War and how he was tough on the USSR. For me, the real Reagan was that Reagan who actually thought that, nuclear war has to be avoided and we have to talk to the Soviets. As he said at one point, Soviet general secretaries kept dying on him, but then ultimately he had a partner in Gorbachev with whom he could talk, and they first met in Geneva in 1985, then they in Reykjavik, and there came this remarkable moment in Reykjavik where they talked about abolishing nuclear weapons altogether, right? It was quote unquote almost decided, to the horror of Reagan's advisors, and we don't know what the reaction of Gorbachev's advisors was to this, but here was an interesting moment of when an American leader thought, okay, well, what if we actually try to play along and see how far we can get, and maybe we can actually change the course of history. I think that, Reykjavik was that.
Going all the way back to Stalin and Truman, you have this quote from Henry Kissinger, who wrote in a 1957 book that the powers which represent legitimacy and the status quo cannot know that their antagonist is not amenable to reason until he has demonstrated it. And he will not have demonstrated it until the international system is already overturned. So, we've got our answer with Putin, but we don't quite have our answer yet with, Xi's China. And you give us this very difficult choice where on the one hand, if Truman had realized, if Stalin turned out to be a reasonable old chap, then we could have had a different timeline. But if not, the price for running that experiment would have potentially been kind of Soviet conquest of Europe or even of the world. How are we supposed to think about that dilemma sitting here in 2025, imagining the future of U.S.-China relations?
Jordan, that's a really great question. I like how you label it the Soviet choice. I think it's not just applicable to the USSR, but the fundamental problem is we don't know what the other guy is really thinking, right? We don't know. And by the way, the other guy may not even know what he wants. Ultimately, this is the case with Stalin. We don't even know now, with the passage of all these years, we don't know what Stalin's ultimate ambitions were. Was he limited in his appetites? Would he stop? Or would he, unless he met with counterforce, would he just keep pushing? Would he keep going until he conquered Europe, and from Europe jump over and conquer Asia and conquer the world? And it sounds fantastic, but appetite comes during eating, as the French say. And so if you are an American policymaker, you're faced with this situation and you're thinking, okay, how do we stop that? What is the most reasonable policy that we can adopt to try to stop that? It seems that the most reasonable policy is the policy adopted, ultimately the policy of containment. You push back on expansionist desires, and the other side has to take this into account, and they are deterred, they limit their ambitions. But as a result, a struggle unfolds that then becomes prolonged confrontation, like the Cold War. So it is kind of a sad situation, but maybe an inevitable situation, an unavoidable situation. And it's sort of like choosing between two evils. On the one hand, containment and the counter-containment that comes with this leads to the Cold War, could potentially actually lead to a hot war. On the other hand, not doing anything could also expose you to a situation where you'll just basically have to accept that the other side dominates everything. And it's the same with China. The fundamental problem that we face with China today, I mean, even with Russia as well, we simply don't really know what the other side wants. Does Xi Jinping want to overturn the existing order, or is he just trying to change China's position in this global order? That is a long debated question that goes back 20, even before Xi Jinping, certainly to the beginning of Xi Jinping era. We don't know the answer to this. And some people say, no, we know the answer. We clearly, we know that Xi Jinping is trying to overturn the world order because, here's the evidence. And they will say, well, I don't know. I'm looking at this evidence and I'll say, I'm not convinced 100% by this evidence. We simply don't know. And we don't know whether Xi Jinping himself knows. We don't know what he knows, right? And whether he himself has decided what he wants to do. So under those circumstances, what is the best policy that you want to pursue? The policy is probably a combination of containment, firmness, plus clear signaling, saying, hey, we see what you're doing. This is going to be our response to that. No jumping around and doing silly things. Like sometimes the American foreign policy sometimes tends to jump around in some ways. I mean, we see that with Trump, but we have also seen that with previous administrations. I mean, with China, consider, for example, Nancy Pelosi's ill-advised visit to Taiwan. What did it achieve, the visit to Taiwan? It was very provocative. It was just completely useless in so many ways. And then as a result, we had a break-off of communication at senior levels between the Chinese and American militaries. Did it benefit anyone? No. What was the point of this? There was no point to this. So what I'm saying is we have to be firm, at the same time maintain dialogue, and at the same time signal to the other side that we see what they're doing and we are preparing certain countermeasures against that. But if they back off at the right moment, we will also not proceed with those countermeasures. And I think that's the way to mitigate great power confrontation and this, this potentially another Cold War that is unfolding before our eyes even today.
Yeah. One last one. I want to kind of apply the lessons of prestige to the U.S.-China and I guess Putin as well relationship. It's like, if you are satisfied by the rate of change of the prestige or the absolute value of the prestige, and like, if there are ways to give prestige that are not fundamentally like compromising core interests in national power, but like, I got taken to Nixon's dacha, so I'm going to chill out about, invading Taiwan or whatever the analogy is. I mean, because it really does seem that like there's a lot of prestige which is in the eye of the beholder. And it's like almost like in America can give prestige in lots of different ways, some of which cost more and some of which cost a lot less.
I mean, you could say that prestige and no prestige core interests exist. And in the book, I talk about, for example, Poland and how that was central to Stalin's security concerns in Europe. And no matter how much prestige he would have gotten from the Allies, he was just going to do what he wanted to do in Poland anyway, because he thought that this was fundamental, red line core to his security interests. And you might say that, that also applies to Putin today or to Xi Jinping today. On the other hand, I think we sometimes underestimate the real importance of signs of recognition, signs of respect, signs of acceptance. And also tend to underestimate the way that some of the things that we do tend to humiliate the other side and result in kind of, in adverse reactions that we would rather have avoided to begin with. So consider President Obama's rhetoric about Putin, Putin being the kid in the back of the classroom, which reportedly outraged him. And now you might say, well, that's ridiculous. Do you think that if Obama did not say that about Putin, that he would not have done X, Y, and Z, including invading Ukraine? Maybe he would have still, because Ukraine is very important to his neo-imperialist vision of what Russia should look like. Or maybe he would not have. We just don't know. It's counterfactual. So it's a question of whether he feels that he's, whether he has the standing, the respectability. I think it does matter in the end. It does matter. So the same thing also probably applies to the Chinese, and it's just important to note, I think, that for all the strategic rivalry that we have with China, difficult relationship with Russia, it is important to pay attention to the fact that these countries are ruled by autocrats who make decisions sometimes just off the top of their heads, just for no particular reason. Sometimes, sometimes in ways that clearly contradict their country's national interests. They do that because they just came, it's just an idea they have that comes into their head because they feel insulted or they feel humiliated or something like that. We should not underestimate those sentiments. And I think in dealing with those countries, we should be careful and we should try to be respectful but firm.
Yeah, I mean, of course, probably even more famously, Barack Obama at the 2011 White House Correspondents' Dinner making fun of Donald Trump for all the birther stuff. Some trace back his desire to run for president to getting humiliated on national television.
That's a great counterexample. So that also applies to us, you see.
And maybe, maybe this is the 4D chess with Trump, right? Is like, okay, we're gonna stop calling Putin a dictator. We're gonna say he's the best thing since sliced bread. I mean, is that gonna make him pull out of Ukraine?
Maybe not, but it's a pile up of things, right? It's over time these things matter. It's not like now suddenly we say, we love you back, and look, come back to G7 or whatever, we'll have a good relationship with you, and he'll say, oh yeah, I'll pull up from Ukraine, because we have already kind of turned that corner, and it's very difficult to go back. But on the road to confrontation, those things do matter. It seems to me they do matter. Not maybe in decisive ways and not always, but I think they do matter.
All right, we'll leave it there. Part 3, we're going to get to dives into archives and reflections on the past and future of Soviet and CCP studies. Sergey Radchenko, Jon Sine, thank you so much for